Hello Internet, I'm on holiday at the moment, but that is not going to stop me from doing a horror review for you, because I'm in Tintagel in Cornwall and I'm lucky enough to be staying at the Camelot Castle Hotel, which was the site for John Badham's 1979 version of Dracula, starring Frank Langella as Dracula, Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing, and the always amazing Donald Pleasance as Dr Seward. The hotel behind me stood in for Dr Seward's asylum. Quite a few of the scenes were actually shot here, the Cornish coastline taking the place of Whitby's coastline. It's fairly cloudy and a little rainy, perfect gloomy atmosphere to have a look at an often forgotten entry into the Dracula film canon, but one which I happen to think is...
Whoa, not so fast. Let's have a little bit of context first. Between 1958 and 74, Hammer had been dominating the Dracula corner of the market. 7 main films in total: Dracula, Dracula Prince of Darkness, Dracula's Risen from the Grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Dracula AD 1972, The Satanic Rites of Dracula. That's not even including the possibly non-canon Brides of Dracula and The 7 Golden Vampires, which is technically canon but doesn't star Christopher Lee, so it's kind of not. So it's not necessarily surprising that there was a bit of Dracula fatigue going on. What also didn't help this particular film, that 1979 was a bonanza year for Dracula movies. Not only did you have the George Hamilton spoof Love at First Bite, but also released alongside John Badham's movie was Werner Herzog's frankly superb remake of the original Nosferatu, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, which ran into copyright problems with the Bram Stoker estate. So Dracula wasn't called Dracula in that version, he was Count Orlok. So poor old Frank Langella was battling in a very full field, and possibly against an audience that had already tired a little bit of the Count. The Hammer movies themselves had started to almost creep into self-parody, and when an out-and-out parody like Love at First Bite comes along, and then the cycle begins all over again with Nosferatu, and then a remake of essentially the 1931 Bela Lugosi movie, it's quite easy to see how one or more of these movies are going to get nudged out of the public conscience. Unfortunately, the one that got nudged was this. Did it deserve to? Let's have a look.
I've been wondering during my time here why Frank Langella's Count isn't as well remembered as Lugosi, Lee and Ullman. And I suspect, before I go back home and watch the movie, that it's because his is the most romantic depiction of the Count's story that there has ever been set to celluloid. Lugosi's Count lured his victims with mesmerism. Remember the remarkable shots of his eyes and those things he did with his hands. Christopher Lee just took what he wanted, and maybe coming after the Technicolor gore of the Hammer movies, the public just didn't want an overtly romantic Dracula again, until Oldman came along and mixed some of Lugosi, a little of Langella definitely, some of Lee, and obviously a majority of the mix that Oldman brought to it was the magic that only he can provide. Like Lugosi before him, Langella's screen Dracula followed a very successful run on the stage on Broadway as Dracula, and Frank Langella's Dracula didn't need mesmerism or didn't take what he wanted. What he wanted was thrown at him. His power came from just being able to walk into a room and women would swoon. So it's not surprising in this version that the older Van Helsing and the older Seward seek to destroy him simply because through his sheer sexual magnetism, almost like a Lord Byron figure. He was a threat to their potency, and just by walking into a room and being with them and being with the women, he made them completely impotent as men. His Dracula didn't need a whole bag of tricks. He just was pure sexual magnetism, and therefore in this version, for that crime alone, had to be killed.
The actors actually stayed in the hotel during filming, and an awful lot of the interiors were used for scenes, like the dinner scene, for example. If you can imagine living in your film sets, it must have felt at times more like a theatre production than a movie production. First up, apologies if my voice is croaky. I've had a horrible cold since I got back from Cornwall, but don't want to hold off talking about this movie for any longer. I think we should kick off with the bad points, because we can rattle right through those, because there are hardly any. The mechanical bat that they've got is hokey. That's just flat out rubbish. The love scene between Dracula and Lucy, which uses the laser beam machine that the Who were touring with. They borrowed it from the Who for a Sunday. So Dracula and Lucy together with a laser behind them and lots of smoke, just like a Who video. Tonally is completely different to the rest of the movie. It doesn't work as for me, as a sort of hyper-real or surreal type of scene. It just jars with the rest of the movie, the tone of which is beautifully gothic. And finally, and this is really harsh, and this is really nitpicky, because fashions change. At the moment, fashion-wise, time has not been kind to Frank Langella's look of the Count. He's got very big hair. He's got the biggest hair of the Count, until it could be argued that Gary Oldman's Big Bouffant is the biggest Dracula hair of all, but this is all Langella's own hair, and he's got big hair. But come on, I'm getting really nitpicky now. The actor playing Dracula's got big hair. His Dracula cape has got a very high collar. It's the sort of classic collar that a kid would draw, and for some reason it just looks a little strange. It looks a little hokey to my eye. The rest of his costumes, the rest of his get-up is superb. He looks every inch the vampire Count to me. Just his cloak looks a little... You can tell how I'm desperately trying to find things to be negative about in a movie that I will, after the cut, begin raving about and tell you why you should check this Dracula out if you haven't already seen it. First up, I want to talk a little bit about the story. It might seem strange focusing on the story of Dracula, a story that everyone probably knows the broad strokes of, but as you Dracula aficionados don't need me to tell you, no movie version of Dracula has ever stuck closely to the original text of Stoker's novel. This movie version, very much like Lugosi's 1931 version, is more an adaptation of the stage play. So there's no section where Harker goes to visit the Count in Transylvania, and so there are no brides of Dracula. That happens to be one of my favourite sections of Stoker's story, so you might have thought that leaving that out wholesale and having the entire of the story set in England would weaken it. To be honest with you, there are tons of Draculas I can go to with those sections in there, so I'm not particularly fussed here. I'm more interested in what this does for this movie. And what it does, it gives you a very different Jonathan Harker than you've ever seen before, played by Trevor Eve. He's young, he's vibrant, he hasn't already been terrified by the Count, so the friction between Dracula and Harker here is over his bride-to-be, and who will win her, essentially. So there's a lot more sexual politicking going on. There's a lot more of the power of envy and jealousy feeding into Harker's animosity towards Dracula in this. So that straight away is a nice different dynamic. A lot of people will get really pissed off that the two female leads have had their names changed. Lucy in this movie is Jonathan's fiancée, and Mina is Dracula's first victim in England. So when I talk about Lucy, I'm thinking Mina. When I talk about Mina in this movie, I'm thinking Lucy. It doesn't matter when the movie's going on, it just makes it difficult to talk about at any length. If that kind of thing's going to piss you off, maybe don't give yourself the aneurysm over this. This does not mean that there's no analogue for Castle Dracula in this film, because Carfax Abbey that he's bought, that Harker attains him the rights to, is basically the stand-in for Castle Dracula in this movie, set on St Michael's Mount in Cornwall, a matte painting of a castle put on top of St Michael's Mount. So any visitor, Renfield visits, Lucy visits, Jonathan visits, Van Helsing visits. So the movie goes there quite a few times, and that is our Count Dracula castle setting. So that element of the story's already there. It's just a slightly different mix. Think of this more as a remix of the classic Dracula story, and I think you'll get on fine with it. The main upshot of this mixing around of all the elements to see what bubbles to the surface in this telling of Dracula is the sexual power play that I've mentioned earlier. What really resonated with me watching this this time round was how much the human males wanted to control their women, and what Dracula offered was the freedom of choice. Is he a vampire in this? Yes. Does he kill people in this? Yes. Does he take over Mina and Lucy in this? Does he feed on them like a parasite? Really? Having watched it again? No. Both of these women choose him, openly choose him. Mina, Lucy really, dies, but she's set up as frail from the beginning. She'd always suffered from some sort of nervous disease or some kind of frailty, so she dies as a result of her encounter with the Count. But Lucy, Mina really, flat out chooses to be with the Count. So the whole final act of our courageous vampire hunters chasing her down and trying to kill the Count, there's a very dark undercurrent in this of her father, the father of her friend who died, and her fiancé wanting to control her. This is not her choice to make who she wants to be with. She can't, because he's evil, and so she must be insane to think this. And there's a point where she's actually put in Dr Seward's asylum. It smacks of Victorian men's attitudes to female hysteria in that sense. And if a woman has crazy ideas of her own independence, then there must be something mentally wrong with her. This is, as I mentioned earlier, the most romantic of the Draculas, and there is a love story at the centre of it. It's not the reincarnation nonsense that was in the Francis Coppola version, which I can dig. I love that version of the movie, but it does take over a whole middle portion of that movie. This goes along at a much faster clip, and it, without all the magic mumbo jumbo and reincarnation, this is very much a consensual relationship. She meets a man who excites and interests her. he meets a woman who excites and interests him. He says in the movie, a kind of encounter with a female intellect like yours is exactly the reason I came to England. And they decide to be together. One of them happens to be a vampire, but this cannot be allowed. He must be killed. Mina, who died at his hands and becomes a vampire, and for that you can read in Stoker's novel and in the Hammer movies, less so here, but there's very much an argument that in an awful lot of these Dracula adaptations and the original, that when you come under Dracula's spell and when he turns you, you actually become, you have your own energy, the power to make your own choices, and these sexual and emancipated women are things that must be staked and their heads must be cut off. I don't know if it was on purpose in this movie. There's a very powerful feminist message running all the way through this, and it's very difficult to see Dracula as the bad guy in this movie. I'm convinced that's on purpose. When you hear Frank Langella talk about the movie and his approach to the Count, and remember he did this for a year on stage as well before, so we're talking about his Count here. He knows what he's talking about. There are no extras on the DVD that I've got, but I believe on some discs there's a documentary called Revamping Dracula, which you can find on YouTube. So if you want to find out more about the movie, to see if you want a taster of it, please check out that, as well as this, frankly, far too long review. But I'm so excited by the movie. It's going to be a long review, and I make no bones about it. Okay, Andrew, I get it. It's a romance story. So does that mean it's not scary? Kinda. There's a couple of really creepy bits in it. When Dracula is at Mina's window and using his fingernails to claw away the putty at a window frame so that he can put his hand in and open up the window, just made me think instantly of Danny Glick in Toby Hooper's Salem's Lot. At the window, let me in, let me in. When Mina is turned and she's found in her vampire form, that's always one of my favourite moments in any movie adaptation, and this one does it in a way that I've never seen before. That's a nice creepy moment. I wouldn't say it was scary, but just because it's romantic doesn't mean that this isn't a film about a fucking vampire. Throats are ripped out, heads are snapped backwards, people are staked. For crying out loud, a baby is drained of all its blood and killed. So this isn't a movie that holds back. It's just not a gore fest. It's a full-on gothic romance. So if that sits a little better with you than just a flat-out romance, this is an absolute gothic romance in the truest sense of those words, and you will get your vampire action in it. I believe, please comment and tell me if I'm wrong, I believe this is the first movie version of the Count where we actually see him, as was described in Stoker's novel, crawling face first down a wall, and seeing him come down towards the window and then just start scratching at the window pane. That's pure vampire chills right there. So don't worry on that account. It's just not the main thrust of the story. So in the final analysis, before my voice gives out altogether, what we really need to know is, how does Frank Langella's Dracula stack up against the other movie versions of the Count that we've seen throughout the decades? And here's the bottom line. He is fucking incredible as Count Dracula. My absolute favourite scene in the movie is when he's invited to be a dinner guest. So you've got the butler and the servants there. You've got Dr Seward and his daughter Lucy. You've got Jonathan there. You've got Mina there, and then Dracula turns up. And from that moment on, it's a power play of status, and Langella, he sweeps the floor with all of them. He's so poised, so controlled throughout his performance, but this is a real bravura, standout scene in the movie. Imagine an account where every movement is so finely controlled and thought out. This man in this performance is in charge of every part of his body. Everything is considered, and he plays it still. There's no energy expended unnecessarily. He's like a big cat sat in the middle of a dinner party. He just happens to be in human form. And his dialogue, the way he delivers it, is phenomenal. It gives some great laughs as well when you watch it. When he's speaking to a woman, he's very attentive, and is very attentive to what they're saying and responds to it. When a man speaks to him, he's so dismissive without being rude, but it's like he's batting away flies. They're kind of not even in the room, the men. They're slight nuisances. When Seward offers him wine, you've got one of the crucial lines in Dracula, you know, I never drink wine. And it's a little like, okay, I'm going to play Hamlet, so how am I going to do to be or not to be? At some point I'm going to have to say I never drink wine, and how do I play it? He downplays it so much. I've never heard the line, I never drink wine, sound more like fuck off and stop bothering me in any other version. It's a glorious thing to behold. Watch his eyes. When the reverse angle comes back on him, and and there are a group of people in front of him, watch his eye line. The man's craft is amazing. He'll be speaking to someone who's coming from here, but his eyes will be looking over at Lucy and Jonathan dancing here. He can't. He's talking to Dr Seward, but he's looking here. His eyes are darting all around the room. He's a predator, after all. He's looking for threats, and he's looking for opportunities constantly. Just Langella's eyeline. He's constantly present in every moment, constantly still but dominating, and hyper aware of everything. And he's an absolute joy to behold as Dracula. He's a draught of cool, fresh water. If you're looking for a kind of Dracula that you've never seen before, check this movie out. It might not be to your taste, but I would suggest, if you're anything like me and are just instantly intrigued by any version of Dracula, fuck me, I even paid good money to go and see Dracula 2000 in the cinema. So that's how much I'll watch a version of Dracula. This one is such a diamond in the rough. Why it's not more well known, I'll never know. Checking out some of the online message boards, you will get people freely saying that this is their favourite Dracula of all time. Now, you have to gauge message boards by the understanding that people who take the time to post on there usually have so much vitriol towards something that they think it's worth their time to post, or so much love towards something that they think it's worth their time to post. But I think this movie's building up ahead of steam. It's building up more love, and I hope in some small way this video can go towards adding to that energy. Is it perfect? Is any Dracula movie perfect? Probably not. But what I find most interesting of all is that, like Sherlock Holmes, Dracula has had the most screen adaptations of any fictional character. I think Holmes is way beyond Dracula, but Dracula is second, and after that the drop-off is enormous. I realise it helps that both characters, the rights to both characters are kind of up for grabs, but I think one of the other reasons is that with Dracula, as with Holmes, the filmmakers and the writers can place meaning onto these characters who, to a greater or lesser extent, are more reflections of the times around which their stories are told. So I think it's very telling that in 1979 we had this Dracula as well as Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. I think the two polar end opposites of how you could portray the Count. The Byronic, romantic male lead and the animalistic, almost subhuman, utter horror bringer of plague. And everywhere in between we've seen every different type of Dracula. And that's one of the reasons why Dracula will keep being told and keep being told. I haven't seen Dracula Untold yet. I think that's probably going to be pretty corny. This one isn't. If you're after a different twist on Dracula from a movie that's a few decades old now, surprise yourself, and then be glad that Frank Langella's having a bit of a career resurrection these last few years, because people should be talking, really should be talking about his Count in the same breaths as Lugosi, Lee, Oldman, Klaus Kinski, Max Schreck, although Kinski and Schreck are different beasts altogether. I might do a Nosferatu video sometime, because that to me is just the scariest Count of all. But Dracula, John Badham, 1979, Laurence Olivier, Donald Pleasance, Frank Langella. What about any of that sounds bad?